Well, good morning, church family. It's wonderful to be with you this morning, even though once again it is remotely. As Ray mentioned a moment ago, we welcome all of you, whether you are a part of our church family in Temple Terrace and watching, or whether you're a part of another church family in Tampa Bay somewhere who is watching with us today and worshiping with us. We know we have people around the country who are being watching every single Sunday, and some in other parts of the world who've been joining us for worship as well. Wherever you may be today, we welcome you. Thank you for being a part of our worship together this morning as we worship again this Lord's Day remotely. So good to have you with us today. Hope you have a Bible. We're going to look today. I have my Bible open to the book of John, 21st division of John's Gospel. We're going to spend all of our time today in John chapter 21. So I'm going to ask you to take your Bible and open there as well. And we'll spend all of our time in this great New Testament passage. At the end of our service this morning, we've been asking you to please stay with us until the very end. We'll ask you to do that again today, because at the end this morning, we want to talk a little bit about next Sunday when we reconvene in our building and some of the protocols for that and some things you need to know about that. We will have just a word to say, as Ray mentioned also at the beginning this morning, about Nancy Barlow and her passing yesterday. This wonderful lady, we want to tell you just a little bit about that. This is Memorial Day weekend. Typically, this would be a weekend when a lot of our members would be traveling various parts of the United States, the official kickoff to summer and all of that. And of course, all that's different because of the pandemic in which we are involved at the moment. But we hope that you enjoy this weekend. We hope you enjoy the day tomorrow. Hopefully, as you can, in whatever way you can, celebrate that safely tomorrow. Well, this morning's lessons, I'm in the midst of doing some special lessons for the church at Valrico, and we are doing those. We're recording those in advance, and they're going to be distributed to the Valrico Church online. And so I've been in the midst of recording some special things for them. And this morning's lesson is one of those lessons for the Valrico Church that I'm going to use you as my guinea pig for this morning. It comes out of John chapter 21. Now, John is a gospel that I've taught many times in Bible classes here. And so what I'd like to do this morning is really take some thoughts that I've presented in Bible class form, and I want to extrapolate from them and add to them and expand on that, if I may, and present some thoughts to you today in sermon form about managing life's ups and downs. You know, in spite of the fact that we're living through the worst pandemic in the last 100 years, there really are a lot of things that are, I think, to be excited about in our church family. After 9-10 weeks out of our building, we have made preparations to meet together again next Sunday. We know that not everybody will feel comfortable about doing that as yet. We know that not everybody should do that as yet. But that's an exciting thing, that we're going to be able to at least meet back in our building again. I think it's exciting that our baptistry has gotten a workout in the first part of this year. There have been so many individuals who've been baptized in the past several months. And God continues to bring wonderful new families to our church family. Now, we haven't been announcing those people to you. We'll do that when we are back together in our building, but we're very thankful for that. And Jonathan is doing great work in his role with us now. He's been with us for just over a year. And so that's been a wonderful blessing to our church family. So there are a lot of good things that are still going on in spite of what's going on in the broader sense in our world. But the question always is, how enthusiastic are we when the good news really has become the old news? I mean, that really is where our character is tested. In so many venues of life, it is much easier to achieve enthusiasm than it is to maintain enthusiasm. Jonathan is talking to us about that in his Bible class this quarter. But we know that's true, don't we? Much easier to achieve enthusiasm than maintain. That's true, you know, in a new marriage, a new job, a new exercise regimen, a new school year, a new life in Christ. Pretty easy to get excited about all of those things. But what do you do when the honeymoon is over, or the job has become tedious, or the muscles are sore, the homework piles up, or your baptism is years and years in the past? Well, I think John 21 provides some insight as to how to maintain an intense faith even after the initial excitement of the moment has passed. So I want us to read together John chapter 21. We're going to read together. We'll dissect that a little bit, make 2 or 3 applications this morning, and then the lesson will be yours. But now, here's the reading. John chapter 21, beginning in verse 1. Let's read together. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And in this way he showed himself. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples were together. And Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. And they said to him, well, we will go with you. And so they went out, and immediately they got into the boat. But that night they caught nothing. Now when morning had come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, children, have you any food? And they answered him, no. And he said to them, well, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. And so they cast, and now they were not able to draw in because of the multitude of fish. Well, therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. Excuse me. Now, when Simon heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, he had removed it, and he plunged into the sea. The other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, but about 200 cubits, dragging the net with fish. And then as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on the fire, and bread. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish which you have just caught. Simon Peter went up, and he dragged the net to land, full of the large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. And Jesus said to them, come and eat breakfast. Yet none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew that it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. And this is the third time that Jesus showed himself to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Well, this is a wonderful narrative, and there are an awful lot of things here that could be considered. What I'd like to do with you is kind of navigate our way through the narrative and highlight some of the points that would be made there. And then we want to make 2 or 3 applications about this idea of managing life's ups and downs. Now, we know something about that, don't we? And because of where we are right now. We know some things about good news and bad news, about high points and low points, about enthusiasm, and then that enthusiasm being dampened, don't we? So let's talk about that, and let's just kind of navigate our way through the text by way of beginning. It begins by saying that Jesus appeared again. Jesus appeared again. Now, again is an interesting concept. Sometimes the word again is used to express tedium. Oh, we're having the same meal again. We are singing the same song again. Jonathan is preaching again. See, I feel your pain in all of that. But sometimes the word again is used to express excitement. We are having Starbucks again. We're having Bluebell ice cream again. The appearance of Jesus was one of those kinds of things. It was just more of a good thing. And so Jesus appeared again. Now, he's appeared to the disciples on at least 2 occasions. One was the evening of his resurrection, and then a week later when he appeared to them again to convince Thomas that in fact he had been raised from the dead. No doubt that was an extraordinarily exciting time for the disciples. Jesus had told the disciples, Matthew chapter 26 and verse 32, he said, after I am raised, I will go before you to Galilee. In other words, I want you to go to Galilee. And so they did. They walked the 70 miles, but time goes by. Now, we don't know how much time elapses, but clearly some time goes by, and Jesus is not there. And so evidently, they get a little restless because they are there, but Jesus is not. And so at some point, Peter says, I'm going fishing. Now, some commentators on the Gospel of John say that this indicates that Peter had decided Jesus wasn't going to show up, and so he was just going to go back to his old way of life. I don't think that's it at all. Fishing was Peter's trade. He had a family to support. And so, in essence, he just goes back to work. He's got to feed his family. And so don't think recreation here when you hear fishing. Think occupation. The challenge here, of course, was, the text says that night they caught nothing. Now, that had to dampen their enthusiasm even more, because now not only was Jesus not there, but seemingly they've lost their touch with their profession. But of course, we know the rest of the story. We know that this is God's doing, that he is preparing Peter and the others for something very special. But maybe one of the lessons there, when this is God's doing, is that there are times that the Christian life is going to, in fact, be frustrating. There are times that life is just frustrating. We said a moment ago, not every day matches the excitement of the day that you were married or the day that your children were born. You know, not every day matches the excitement of the day that you were baptized. Not every day matches the excitement of the Sunday that we moved into this building in July of 2005. Not every day of marriage is a honeymoon. Not every day of school matches the excitement of the first day of school in August or the last day of school in May. There's a lot of time in between. I remember when my kids were in school, we would sit down at the dinner table at night many, many times, and I would say, well, how was school today? And they would always say the same thing, fine. Well, what happened at school today? Nothing. Are you sure? Nothing happened. And I would always think to myself, you know, you were there for 7 hours today. Nothing happened. Maybe I need to go to school and see what's going on. But not every day is exciting as the first or the last day of school. Not every day as a parent matches the excitement of the day that your child was born. In almost every endeavor of life, there is a peak of enthusiasm followed by a valley of the mundane. And I think it's in the valley of the mundane so often that we are tempted. We're susceptible, I think, on those plain, ordinary, vanilla days, because those are the kind of days that we tend to let our guard down. And so, this has to be a discouraging time. Now, the text says that the disciples did not realize that this was Jesus who was talking to them. Why not? Why didn't they realize that? I mean, after all, they knew Jesus very, very well. Have you ever noticed how many times after the resurrection that Jesus appeared to people, but they don't seem to recognize him? I've always found that to be fascinating. For example, Mary Magdalene, when she is at the tomb of Jesus, and Jesus speaks to her, and she just doesn't recognize him. And we say, well, you know, she's crying, she's weeping, and so her eyes are full of tears, so she didn't see clearly. Or we say, well, it was still dark. I mean, the sun wasn't fully up yet, and so she couldn't see real clearly. Well, those are both true, but I wonder if there wasn't something different about Jesus so that he wasn't immediately recognizable to her. Or I think about those two individuals on the road to Emmaus. So you've got two disciples walking on the road to Emmaus, and Jesus, he catches up with them, and they have this conversation. But the text makes it very clear that they didn't recognize Jesus. And so it's getting late, and he says, well, it's time for me to go. And they say, no, stay and have dinner with us. Stay here. And so they do. They prepare a meal. And in Luke chapter 24 and beginning in verse 30, as they were sitting then at dinner, Jesus took bread and he gave it to them. And the text says that when he gave it to them, their eyes were opened and they recognized who he was. Now, I've always thought that maybe what opened their eyes when he distributed the bread to them was that maybe they saw the imprint. Remember what Jesus said to Thomas, see the print of the nail in my hand and feel in my side. And so I've always thought that maybe when he handed them the bread, they saw the imprint of the nail and it clicked together for them. This is Jesus. But clearly, for a time, they didn't recognize him. And even in this passage, in John chapter 21, and beginning, for example, in verse number 12, Jesus said to them, come and eat breakfast, and yet none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you, knowing that it was the Lord. And so clearly, there was something different about him. I don't know exactly what that was, but something is different, it seems to me, about the post-resurrection Jesus. Now, when Jesus speaks to them, he says, did you catch anything? Wouldn't that be a frustrating question? If you are a group of fishermen, not just one, but you're a whole group, and you've been fishing all night, and you caught nothing. I think that would be frustrating. I think because I don't know much about fishing at all. I've said many times that I don't fish, I don't fish, I don't like to fish, which is really not true. I hate to fish. I don't fish. I've told people before, the last time I went fishing, I was 14 years old. And I promised God that if that day would just end, I would never, ever put myself through that kind of agony again. And so here, these guys are in that same situation I was when I was 14. Hours and hours and hours, and you sit there and you catch nothing. It is extremely frustrating. Did you catch anything? Look at their answer. No. No elaboration, just no. And Jesus says, well, how about trying the right side of the boat? Throw your nets over there on the right side of the boat, and I think you might have better fortune. Now, you might expect the apostles at this point in time to just explode. I mean, after all, they were professional fishermen. They had plied these waters, hundreds of times, perhaps? And now, some stranger is going to tell them how to do their job. I think there's a lesson in that. I think the lesson in that is that it's imperative to note that there are going to be times when God asks you to obey, when God's going to ask you to do something, and it may be that it makes no sense to you, or it's just the opposite of what you would want to do. There are times God does that. I've said countless times from this pulpit that I think the hardest thing the Lord ever asked us to do is Matthew 5 and verse 44. When he said, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. Is there anything God ever asked us to do that's more difficult than that? And it's one of those moments where he says, look, try the right side of the boat. Well, that didn't make any sense to me. But he says, try what I say and see if it doesn't work for you. I think there are a lot of things God asks us to do that at least our world would say make no sense whatsoever. If you are a single Christian adult and God says, maintain your moral purity, the world looks at that and says that is the most fanciful, ridiculous idea in the world. But God is asking us to do something because he believes, no, because he knows that that's for the best. Now, the upshot of their obedience to what Jesus told them to do was that they were not able to haul the net in because of the great number of fish. And so, because of that, these men deduce it is the Lord. And that's what they say. It's the Lord. And so John says, Peter, this has got to be the Lord. John, in essence, says, look, Peter, we have been here before. And this goes back to Luke chapter 5, where you've got a very similar scenario where Jesus causes a miraculous catch of fish to occur for these same men. And so they accurately conclude this must be the Lord. Now, you got that interesting scene where Peter jumps in and he begins swimming. And I don't know exactly why he did that, but maybe given his excitability, that's entirely in place for him. But I want you to read verses 8 and 9 with me. This will not be on the screen. Let's read together. Beginning in verse 8. The other disciples came in a little boat. They were not far from land, about 200 cubits, and they dragged the net with fish. And as soon as they came to land, they saw a fire of coals there with fish on it and bread. And I've always wondered about that. Where did Jesus get his fish? Was that a natural thing? Had he been fishing earlier in the morning? Or maybe it was supernatural. Or maybe it is that when the Lord does something that to him is natural, it's supernatural to us. I don't know. But he's fixing them breakfast. Now, one other point just here in the narrative that's interesting to me, and that is, it says there were 153 fish. Why'd they include that? There were 153 fish. Theologians have had a field day with that. Because theologians, as they've written about John 21 and 153 fish, they have supposed that there has to be some mystical, magical, deep meaning to that. And so Cyril of Alexandria said, look, 100 equals 100-fold, the fullness of the Gentiles. 50 equals the number of the remnant of Israel. 3 is the number of the Trinity. And so you add together, you get 153. Maybe. Augustine said 10 represents the 10 commandments, 7 is the perfect number of grace, 10 plus 7 equals 17. You add together all the numbers between 1 and 17 and it equals 153. Well, I did that on my calculator and lo and behold it does. Is that the significance? The church father Jerome said that there were 153 different varieties of fish in the Sea of Galilee, and they caught one of each. Now, William Barclay, a more modern commentator, agrees with that, and he suggests that the 153 different kinds of fish represent God's redemption of all the nations and people of the earth. That it's kind of like Jesus' parable about casting the dragnet into the sea, that this is kind of a living parable of that. Why 153? Well, because that's how many they caught. I mean, have you ever known a fisherman who didn't count the fish? So they caught 153. You know what the significance of that is, ladies and gentlemen? The significance of that, I believe, says something about the generosity of God, the generosity of Christ. I mean, Jesus could have counted the number of men in the boats and let them catch one for each. Come, cook it, be full, and all's well that ends well. But that's not what he does. He gives in abundance. He gives in abundance. And the upshot of this is that they're excited once again. Now, with that background, that's kind of a long introduction, but I'm going to tell you now the sermon is not going to take very long. I'm going to make 3 simple observations here in the lesson to be yours. I make these observations in Bible class because I think, to me, they just kind of leap off the page here, where the disciples have been, the disciples have just been on a roller coaster of emotion. And I think 3 things are said here about that are important to understand. Here they are. Number 1, enthusiasm fluctuates. We need to be realistic about that. There are ups and downs of life. The disciples have gone through a roller coaster of emotion in the last month, just like we all do in life. Every day is not the same. Now, for the disciples, the highs and lows have been dramatic. I mean, they have experienced a triumphal entry into Jerusalem, but then the desertion in Gethsemane. You talk about a high and a low, that's it. They had experienced the despair of crucifixion, but then the excitement of resurrection. And now they go to Galilee, and there is restlessness there because Jesus isn't there. But then the enthusiasm returns with the presence of both the fish, the miraculous catch, and Jesus. And so it's just one up and down after another. And that kind of reflects our life, doesn't it? I mean, life is not just static at all. And the point of that is that it's natural for levels of enthusiasm to change a bit. And could I just say to you that you shouldn't feel guilty. You should not feel guilty if you're not always on a high about your job or your marriage or even your Christian life. I've had people say to me, you know what, Don, I just wish that I could be as excited as the day that I was baptized. Well, that's going to be a challenge for you. Because that is a one-time moment in time event. It doesn't mean that doesn't have meaning to you. It doesn't mean that you can't reflect upon it and maintain and generate excitement from that memory. But there are some experiences that can't be duplicated. But that's not the standard by which your faithfulness is measured. You know, point-in-time events are special. They etch themselves into our memory, but you don't have the same feeling oftentimes that you did when you witnessed it. You know, since there's been an absence of live sports, ESPN and other networks have been showing, so many classic moments from major sports, from baseball and hockey and basketball and football. The other night on ESPN, they showed Game 1 of the World Series from 1988. And Game 1, the 1988 World Series featured my favorite baseball team, and that's the Los Angeles Dodgers. I grew up in Southern California. I grew up a Dodgers fan. I'm a Dodgers fan to this day. And in 1988, the World Series was between the Los Angeles Dodgers and the evil empire known as the New York Yankees. And in Game 1, Game one, Kirk Gibson. There is an iconic moment that every LA Dodgers fan has etched in their mind. Kirk Gibson was injured. He could barely walk, but he came up in the bottom of the ninth inning, 2 outs in the bottom of the ninth. He came up with one man on base, and he hits a walk-off home run. He circles the bases. Every Dodger fan can hear Vin Scully, the Hall of Fame announcer, announcing that. And every Dodger fan can see Kirk Gibson rounding the bases and the euphoria that went on with that, and all the excitement with that. But I got to tell you that when I watched that the other night, I didn't have the same feeling that I did when I watched it live in 1988, which I can remember, by the way. Well, why not? Well, because it's different now. Emotions fluctuate. There are some feelings and emotions that can't be duplicated. It doesn't mean they're not special to you. It doesn't mean that memory is not an important part of your life. But you can't live in the memory. Even something as critical as your baptism is designed to be the beginning point where you begin to rise, to walk in newness of life. But that implies that you've got to move forward to make progress, and you've got to experience new experiences spiritually. Enthusiasm fluctuates. We've got to be realistic about that. Secondly, priorities matter. And so we've got to be obedient. Priorities matter. So we've got to be obedient even though the emotions may fluctuate a bit. And so the disciples continue to function even when they are frustrated and discouraged. They did what they were supposed to do. They were obedient even while waiting. Listen to Paul in Galatians 6 and verse 9. Let's not grow weary while doing good, because in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. And so when the excitement of the moment is gone and the routine now becomes the norm, that's when we test our character. The test of character is, how do you handle things when the excitement of the first day of a new semester is over, or when the first day of a new job is long in the past, or when the honeymoon is over, or when your initial obedience to God in baptism is years in your rearview mirror. The test of character is, what do you do then? Jonathan's teaching this wonderful class about lifelong zeal. That's about developing, maintaining, keeping, living the character that says, I understand that underneath that experience in the past, there is meaning. There's something that's valuable. And that value is something that I'm going to build on every day of my life. Jonathan's doing a great job in talking to us about that. I thought the teaching this morning, particularly about the Lord's Supper, to keep in mind and bring us back to those points, those touch points in our life that are so important. I thought that was especially valuable. You know, we have to remember, ladies and gentlemen, that beneath the new that inevitably wears off, there's meaning and substance. At my house, I still have my college diploma from all those years ago. As Jonathan said, from centuries ago. It's probably on ancient parchment, evidently. But I still have that. I have my diploma. Now, it's put away somewhere, but it's not thrown away. I put it away. I didn't throw it away. Well, why not? Well, because I haven't seen it in years, but it still has some meaning. It represents something. My baptism was 48 years ago. It was 48 years ago next month. 2,496 Sundays have passed since my baptism. 2,496 Sundays have passed since my baptism. But I still remember that Sunday morning as though it were yesterday. I remember that it was a Sunday morning, a beautiful day in Kennett, Missouri. My dad preached during the invitation. I pried my fingers off the back of the pew in front of me, and I walked down an aisle on a Sunday morning. I remember the gentleman who went back and helped me change into the baptismal clothes. I remember his name. I remember him talking to me and the things that he said as I prepared for my baptism 48 years ago. I remember the look on my dad's face when we met in the baptistry. Now that's 48 years ago, 2,496 Sundays. But beneath the excitement of that day, there was meaning. After all those years, that meaning is still there. See, I don't think God expects us to go around and every day be saying, glory, hallelujah, praise God, as though every day we are on a spiritual high. But he does expect us to be faithful and obedient and to maintain a level of intensity about our faith, a lifelong zeal, to use Jonathan's class words, that demonstrates to others what our priorities are. So if we go back to Galatians 6 again, let's not grow weary while doing good. In due season we reap if we do not lose heart. We have to remember that, ladies and gentlemen, that all of Christianity is not a mountaintop experience. Every day of your Christian life is not like Moses on Sinai or Elijah on Carmel or Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. There are a lot of valleys you have to cross. Spiritual valleys, relational valleys, physical valleys, financial valleys, personal valleys. And I think it's then that Satan slides up next to us and he tells us one of two lies. He says to us either, your God must not care much about you. If your God cared about you, then he wouldn't let you be in the valley. I mean, if he really loved you, then he wouldn't let you be having this spiritual dilemma, this financial problem, this relational issue. If God loved you, he wouldn't let you be in the valley. And if we don't listen to that, then Satan will say to us, you know what your problem is? You're not cut out to be a Christian. The reason you're in the valley is you're not really cut out to be a Christian. We need to remember, ladies and gentlemen, we need to remember the old saying that we are not called to always be happy, but we are called to always be holy. Priorities matter, and so be obedient. And then third, and the lesson will be yours. Third, and that is that Christ will appear. We need to be prepared. Now, the disciples didn't know when Jesus was going to show up. They just knew that he had said to them in Matthew 26 and 38, look, after I am raised, I will go before you into Galilee. Meet me there. And so he promised them, look, I'm going to be there. I will appear. So you be there and be prepared. And so they wait. They wait. Now, I want you to track with me for just a minute here, if we may. And it's important to understand that he's promised us too, that he's going to appear again. And so we too need to be prepared. There's as Paul Harvey used to say, and that's the rest of the story. The rest of the story in John chapter 21 is that there are three areas that God wants us to recognize, accept, live in order to be prepared for when he shows up. Because really everything in the first 14 verses is just preliminary. It's precursor to get us to the story of Jesus having a conversation with the Apostle Peter. Really, that's where this is going. And so Jesus wants to have this conversation with the Apostle Peter. And he tells Peter three things. And there are three things that Peter needs to accept and live. And they're the same three things that we need to accept and live as we're waiting for Christ to appear. There are three things that have to be done in our life to be prepared for when Christ appears. Now, these are not going to be on the screen, so let me just give them to you verbally. The first is, Jesus says, Peter, you've got to face your past so that you can embrace your future. And I'm sure Peter didn't want to do that. He didn't want to go back to the night where he betrayed Jesus. But Jesus walks him up to the big picture window of his life and shows him the night of his greatest failure. And he makes him look at that and deal with that. And so 3 times he says, Peter, do you love me? You denied me 3 times. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And the point that Jesus is making to the Apostle Peter is, look, before you can embrace your future, you're going to have to deal with the failures of your past. But then secondly, he says, Peter, Peter, you need to discover your purpose, and you got to fulfill that with passion. And so Jesus says, Peter, here's your job. Here's your purpose. Here's what I have in mind for you. He said, I want you to focus not on the Apostle Peter. I want you to focus on others. Feed my sheep. Feed my lambs. Shepherd the flock. And so in order for Peter to be prepared for when Christ appears again, Jesus said, you're going to have to focus on others. And so he says to him, I want you to feed, shepherd my lambs, my sheep, my flock. We all have to do that because we all have a flock. Man, woman, young, old, everybody has a flock. If you have a family, you have a flock. If you teach a Bible class, you have a flock. If you teach a class at a secular school, you have a flock. If you work a job and have influence among your peers, you have a flock. If you go to school and you have influence among your schoolmates, you have a flock. If you have friends, you have a flock. And so as Philippians 2 says, don't look out simply for yourself, but look out for the needs of others. Do nothing through selfish ambition or empty conceit, but in lowliness of mind, consider others better than yourself. And then third, he says, Peter, look at yourself first. Because Jesus says to Peter, you know what, Peter? I need to tell you that there's going to be a price paid for your faithfulness. And the price is that you're going to give your life as a martyr for me. And Peter thinks about all that, and he looks over and he sees the disciple that Jesus loved, and we assume is talking about John. And Peter says, well, Lord, fine. Okay, all right, I got you there. Yeah. What about him? Well, what about John? And Jesus says, don't worry about John. Jesus says to him, you follow me. And so, in order for Peter to be prepared for whenever it is that the silence of heaven is broken and Jesus comes back again, the Apostle Peter and you and me, all of us, to be prepared, we've got to do exactly what Jesus was getting to in this passage. You got to face your past so you can embrace your future. You've got to discover your passion, and you got to fulfill that. You got to live that. Discover your purpose and live that with passion. And third, you got to make sure that you look at yourself first. That's how we prepare for our interview with Jesus as well. Now, the challenge for the disciples and the challenge for us is that they didn't know when the Lord was going to show up, and neither do we. So you have this passage in Mark, the 13th division, where Jesus says, about that day and hour knows no one, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. And so be on guard. You don't know when that time is going to come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house. He puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned task. And he tells the one at the door to keep watch. And therefore, you keep watch, because you don't know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows or at dawn. If he comes to you suddenly, don't let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. That's the challenge. Because we don't know when he's going to come back. And the challenge in our world is that we live in a world very much like 2 Peter 3, where Peter said, in the last days, scoffers will come, mockers will come, and they will say, where's the promise of Jesus coming? You Christians always talking about the second coming of Christ. Where is he? 2,000 years is a mighty long time. Seems like ample time. If you're going to come back, surely would have come back by now. 3 simple observations about this. Number 1, Jesus is coming again. Acts 1 and verse 11. The angel said to the apostles as they witnessed Jesus ascend into heaven, they said, men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven. He's coming again, but secondly, we don't know when. You know, in our Bible class on 1 Thessalonians, we said in the first lesson, as we were talking about the Thessalonians and their misunderstanding about the second coming of Christ, we said we don't have a tracking chart, like a hurricane tracking chart here in Florida. We just don't have that for the second coming of Christ, so we don't know when. So therefore, we ought to be prepared. We ought to be prepared. We don't know when he's coming. We just know that he's promised that he will. In 2017, Hurricane Irma had come from the Atlantic, and it dipped down to the south of Florida. And the projected track on that Sunday morning in September of 2017, was that Hurricane Irma, Category 4 hurricane, was going to come right on top of Tampa Bay. But if you were living here, you no doubt remember that when Hurricane Irma came in as a Category 4, and it came in down at Naples, and then it began to make its way north, coming toward Tampa Bay, at the last, Hurricane Irma jogged a little bit to the east, and we were spared. And so we could watch it coming, and we knew that if the projections were correct, there was going to be significant damage. And so what did we do? We prepared. That's the first time in 26 years of living in Florida that I boarded up my windows. I've used an illustration many times. When I lived in the state of Texas, when I lived in Houston, Hurricane Gilbert was a Category 5 hurricane that came again down from the Atlantic and around the coast of Florida, and it came in the Gulf of Mexico, and it wasn't going to turn back to the east toward Florida or go straight up toward Louisiana. It was coming to Texas. And Hurricane Gilbert was massive. It covered almost the entire Gulf of Mexico. And so as we were over in Houston, we were told that that hurricane was coming directly toward where we lived, that it was coming toward that Gulf Coast. And so there were mandatory evacuations all along the Gulf Coast of Texas. And I will never, ever, ever forget a judge in Brazoria County, just south of Houston, who said to the residents, if you refuse to evacuate, please leave us your fingerprints so we can identify your remains and notify your next of kin. Because the fact of the matter is, that hurricane was coming. We had a pretty good idea of when, but we didn't know exactly. And we knew we needed to prepare. Ladies and gentlemen, spiritually, we've been warned. And we can either escape danger by being prepared and doing the things that Jesus said in conversation to the Apostle Peter, or we can suffer the consequences of our refusal. But the choice is entirely ours. Well, thank you for listening so well today. I've talked longer this morning than I anticipated, and I apologize for that. I'll give you some minutes back at some future date. One day I'm going to have to just get in the pulpit and say, well, good morning, shall we stand and sing, and give you the minutes back. But thank you for listening so very, very well. Jonathan and I have been trying to emphasize at the end, at the end of our sermon periods on Sunday, the preparation's imperative. And it doesn't matter that we're in the middle of a pandemic and we have to practice social distancing. I will tell you, we absolutely will make an exception in baptizing you into Jesus Christ. And so today, as you've thought about these things, thought about the fact that we know that he's coming again and we don't know when, so we need to prepare if you're not prepared for that. But you understand that you need to be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins so you can stand right before God. You contact us. You contact us. And we'll baptize you into Christ. We will take care of that immediately.